Welcome to Sex Ed with DB. I'm your host, DB. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the podcast. If you love and support the work that we do, head to www.sexedwithdb.com and buy some of our hot new merch. Follow us on Instagram at sexedwithdbpodcast. And if you want to advertise with us, shoot us an email at sexedwithdb@gmail.com. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Cecile Gasnol of Smile Makers, a femtech brand dedicated to the pleasure of people with vulvas. Smile Makers was created with the ambition to bring female sexuality out in the open and pleasure products to the shelves of mainstream retail. Let's give a warm welcome to Cecile. Hello, Cecile. How's it going today?
Hi, Danielle. It's going great. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really happy that you're here. You said, you're in Singapore, in beautiful Singapore. It's almost a full day ahead there, which is so crazy.
It's the morning. It's beautiful morning outside, so it's going to be a great day, I think.
Good.
And I'm very excited to start the day by talking with you, and I'm very excited to be part of Sex Ed with DB. I think it's a very cool project that you're working on.
Oh, thank you. And we are obviously such a big fan of Smile Makers. We're really excited to get to know you a little better and hear all about your involvement with that. So let's start off with you saying your name, your pronouns, and how you identify, whatever that means to you, whether that's your job title or your gender identity or however you want to identify.
Okay, so my name is Cecile. My pronouns are her, she. I identify as, I don't know, a human. Usually I say I'm a woman. Someday I feel more French than others. I'm also a very happy inhabitant of Singapore, so a mix of a lot of things.
Excellent. Amazing. And what is your role with Smile Makers?
So originally, I actually joined Smile Makers to really develop the whole digital platform for the brand. That means creating the website, creating the social media, starting to talk with people online around the brand. And that really got me into actually talking about sex and masturbation every day with people from all over the world who were interacting with the brand. So that turn into something more than just doing digital stuff for the brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, incredible. And how long have you been working with them?
So I've been working with Smile Makers for over 4 years now. I think I was employee number 3 there. The brand was actually
that's awesome.
Yeah, the brand is almost 8 years old already. It was created end of 2012. And then for a while, the founders were not hiring anyone. And then once they started, I was one of the first to join the company.
Very cool. And if you could just give us an overview of what is Smile Makers, what is y'all's mission, what do you really care about, and kind of what do you all do to kind of promote self-pleasure and masturbation?
So Smile Maker is a femtech brand. It's dedicated to the pleasure of people with vulvas. It was created at the end of 2012 with the ambition to bring female sexuality out in the open and pleasure products to the shelves of mainstream retail. We're the only brand in this category that has never sold in sex shop, and we have partnered with some of people's favorite retailers to launch their sexual wellness categories. So we're a very mission-driven brand, and we're a small team. We're around 10 people, 8 different nationalities, 2 genders, very different personalities, but I'd say one common ambition, which is to normalize how people perceive female sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And that all really shines through on your social media and your website and just how inviting your toys look and how bright and colorful and kind of unashamed you all are when it comes to pleasure and masturbation. I think that is so incredibly needed for everyone around the world, especially since depending on where you are in the world, it can be way more taboo than in other places. For example, if you're originally from Europe, for example, it can be, depending on the country, obviously, and the culture, but folks from Europe tend to be less taboo about sexuality than, say, Americans or kind of other people in other countries and cultures. Is that something kind of that you've found? I mean, just getting into our question here about vulva masturbation around the world and like what kinds of toys are bought where, kind of what are the trends that you see?
Okay, there were a lot of elements in your question. First, on the first part, where you said that, for example, in Europe, we tend to think people are more open when it comes to sexuality, and maybe less so in the US, and even less so in, I don't know, Asian countries, for example. That's not necessarily true. That's not always what we see, and that's what's been so exciting working for Smile Makers, is that when you actually are on the ground of a market, of a country, and talking to people, you realize that we have a lot of preconceived ideas about other cultures. I'm French, and everybody has assumptions that French are very open-minded when it comes to talking about sex out in the open. That's actually not really the case. That's more a cliche idea that people have about French culture, but we don't find it that easy to get people to talk openly about the sexuality of people with vulvas in France. We've got Swedish people in the team, and that's the same. I think we see the same thing in Sweden. Everybody assumes that Swedish are really, open-minded, and you can talk about sex super openly. And we didn't find it to be the case, actually. I think that in the US, at least for the past years, there's really been a growing conversation about the topic of vulva sexuality, vulva pleasure, and vulva pride. And add as a last point that we work a lot in Asian countries as well. And we also see that some countries are more open-minded than we would think, but it can be expressed differently. It can be expressed within the context of matrimony, for example. And then if you put the conversation in that context, then the conversation is very fluid and easy. And we've even seen religious institution in Malaysia, which is a very Muslim country, support the brand and invite the brand to talk in conferences. And we've seen like imams talking about how it is important to make sure that your spouse feels pleasure in bed, and that if you cannot bring that to her yourself, then you should be using aids to reach that person. So we've really had a lot of, I would say, moments where we realized, we thought one thing and that's actually not true. And every countries we've entered, people always see their cultures as more conservative than other countries. We always see ourselves as more conservative. We're always going to say, oh no, but here we do things differently. We don't like to talk about that. And actually, that's not the case. It depends about how you talk about things. What we've seen is that, so from the very beginning, within a year after launching the brand, Smile Makers, we were selling in Asia, Europe, in the US. And what we do is that when we expand into a new country, we always start by surveying people's behavior when it comes to vulva, masturbation, and sexuality. There are things that we see from one country to the other that are really universal, I would say. In pretty countries where we've done surveys, we've seen that over 60% of vulva owners say that they do masturbate. And then depending on how you look at it, it's a lot or it's not a lot. It's less than for people with penises. But there's no anatomical reason why people with vulva should masturbate less than people with penises. So there's definitely a stigma that we can see in all countries. But what's very interesting is that in all countries where we ask the question, how do you view someone who owns a vibrator? 9 out of 10 vulva owners said that they view that person positively, which means that the stigma is perceived, but it's not real. When you own a vibrator, other vulva owners are not judging you. 9 out of 10 are actually viewing you positively.
Which is super important, because if that's if you're kind of worried about social norms and how people are going to judge you, that's a really important statistic to know of like, oh no, people actually think this is cool and like think that it's okay.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's, I think it's such a great statistic to show the power of um, mental representation, because there is no reality to this perception, but we all think that we're going to be judged if we say, I have a vibrator.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really trying to bring that information out in the open so that people realize that that's not real. And like something that Smile Makers has always focused on since the beginning is to bring vibrators out in the open and in mainstream retail. So for example, we've never sold in sex shops. That was really like one of the first decisions we've made from the start. And the objective was, how do we bring vibrators on the shelf of beauty stores, pharmacies, fashion retailers, department stores, to really show that those are normal products. They belong in the shops where you go every day, because it's a perfectly normal thing to do, to use a vibrator.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we do see that varies from one country to the other is vibrator usage. For example, in the US, it's much more widespread. More than 50% of people with vulvas in the US said that they have used a vibrator. In Singapore, when we did the survey, it was around 20%, so less than half of that percentage. In Malaysia, 31%. But what is very interesting is that this is not a static fact, meaning that this percentage moves, and it moves as you bring vibrators on the shelf of mainstream retail. I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is in Taiwan. So I know it's a bit far from the US, but Taiwan is a very interesting country. We did a survey in Taiwan in 2013 before we entered the market. And then when we were asking the question, have you ever used a vibrator? We had 24% of vulva owners saying they had. So 1 out of 4 women. We did the same study in 2019, so 6 years later, after having been in Taiwan's main pharmacies for 6 years. Now it's up to 60%.
Wow. That's in a pretty short period of time to kind of like culture change the way in which people see the need for or desire for vibrators.
Yeah, and we see the same thing in France. In France, it was 31% in 2014, and it was 43% in 2019. And frankly, I think there are two things here that are at play. First, obviously, the fact that there is an easier access to vibrators now because there is more access for mainstream retailers. So that has an impact on vibrator ownership. But it also has an impact on how comfortable people are to admit that they have a vibrator or they have used a vibrator. So that's why the statistic goes up. It's a combination of more people having vibrators and more people being comfortable saying that they have.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also sure that like the media, like what people are watching in terms of like feminist TV shows and movies that are like including vibrators as part of main characters' daily or weekly lives, I'm sure that really normalizes it for people as well.
I absolutely agree. There is a bit of a nuance is I think that 15 years ago we could already see vibrators on TV show, and of course I'm thinking about Sex and the City.
That's what I was just thinking. Samantha just like touting around a vibrator in Sex and the City.
Yeah, and that had an impact. But the shift that we're seeing now is not caused only by media, because it's always been, like it hasn't always been, but for the past 20 years, we have seen vibrators in TV shows and movies. And it was often phallic vibrators. The rabbit is like very phallic object. What is interesting now is to see that things are also shifting in the kind of vibrators that people are using. What we see, for example, on our own eShop is that in the US or in the UK, our visitors from those countries, they tend to favor more external vibrators. So vibrators meant to stimulate the clitoral glands, the labia of the vulva, the whole vulva, all erogenous zones. and a bit less internal vibrators. On the contrary, in France or Singapore, they tend to pick more internal vibrators. In South Korea, our bestseller happens to be our tongue vibrator. So we see some variations per country. But what we see as well is that people don't choose the same vibrator depending on what information and guidance is made available to them. And by that, I mean that by default, what we've seen with our retailers or on our own website is that we tend to pick penetrative products if we don't have more information or more guidance. And what we did, I think it was almost 4 years ago, is that we developed a quiz on our website, and people can use it when they're not on our website, to help people find the best match among our collection, depending on what they like when they masturbate, when they are with a partner. And what we've seen with this quiz is that when people take that quiz, they actually tend to buy more external vibrators designed for clitoral stimulation than people who don't take the quiz and then tend to buy penetrative vibrators. So it really shows we've been wired to desire penetrative products because we've been taught that sex equals, for vulva owners, penetration, which is really incorrect. First, because it dismisses the sexuality of many people who don't sleep with penis havers. And it also dismisses the fact that 70% of vulva owners actually need clitoral stimulation to climax. Mm-hmm. So if you're a product for your pleasure, it makes sense that this product focuses more on external stimulation. But, and I'm sure that's why you actually are doing this podcast, is that we don't receive comprehensive sex education.
Right.
Sex education, when we have any, it's about, for girls, it's about how do we not get pregnant, how do we not catch STIs, and this is super important, but there's nothing about pleasure.
Yes,
and really, really show the importance of pleasure education. Like this very simple fact of observing how people tend to choose a vibrator for themselves depending on the information you give them and how you make them curious about what they usually like. It has such a big impact on their choice that it really shows how we behave differently if we're given the right tool to understand how our pleasure works.
Yes, 1000%. And that's just so fascinating to me, just about kind of what you were saying, the data that you've gathered between the different countries, and just the fact that people are more likely to buy clitoral vibrators if they don't have that information and kind of knowledge and guidance that you were sharing. But yeah, those patterns are super interesting to me, because I'm sure also there are, other factors that kind of play into it, whether or not it's, you heard from a friend that this is a good vibrator, or you watched a YouTube video about it. So there's just so many things, I'm sure, that impact someone's, decision to purchase the kind of vibrator that they are.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So on to the next question, which is super interesting, and I'm so glad that you kind of posed this when we were originally talking, but the 3 most common questions that you get from vulva owners in terms of, whether that be having to do with your products, or whether that has to do with sexual health or pleasure, and as well as the answers to those questions, because I know that you all have, relationships with sexologists who kind of are the people who answer these very important questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've been very amazed by is that people tend to reach out not only with questions about our product, but with a lot of questions about sexuality. And we ended up collecting all those questions and working with sexologists to make sure that we will bring reliable answers to those very important questions. One of the most popular questions that we get, and we get it on Instagram DM, on our website, at our customer care email, at fair events when we were allowed to meet people in real life and that we could actually meet vulva owners and they were asking us questions. The one that comes back all the time is, I have never had an orgasm. Is that normal? So the first thing is that when people ask that question, it often means that what they're really asking is, I've never had an orgasm through vaginal penetration, which really shows that we tend to think that this is how you should get an orgasm. And we don't value enough the importance of clitoral orgasm. So when we ask that question to sexologists, they will often tell us, okay, first we need to replace the context of an orgasm. So it has a physiological definition, of course, which is like involuntary contractions of the vaginal wall through the stimulation of the clitoris. But it's really to explain to people, if you stimulate yourself externally, if you stimulate your clitoris and that you experience an orgasm, that's an orgasm.
Right.
So there is no like clitoral and vaginal orgasm. It will always come from clitoral stimulation. It just happens that through penetration, you could in some way stimulate the internal structure of the clitoris and therefore lead to an orgasm. But this is a bit harder to do because the clitoris is harder to reach, obviously, through the vaginal wall. Mm-hmm. And the most popular way, for example, for vulva owners to masturbate is through external stimulation. And this is a statistic from, I think it was the Height study. So I'm sure you know her, like she was a very famous sex researcher in the 70s. And Kinsey as well, when they did the studies, the success rate, if I might call it that, of vulva masturbation is 94%. So when a vulva owner masturbates, and they do that mostly by external stimulation, they have an orgasm. So that's why when people ask, I've never had an orgasm, the first thing is to say, really, what do you mean exactly by that? Do you mean when it is with a partner, or when it is by using an internal vibrator, or do you mean even when you touch yourself externally? Because it's more rare when someone who touches themselves externally never had an orgasm. Mm-hmm. And then advice from sexologists is to release yourself from the pressure of having orgasms in the first place, and to just indulge in the pleasure. You don't have to, like a very interesting tip that some sexologists have shared with us is you can put a clock of 10 minutes during which you explore yourself, and you just breathe slowly and really focus on the sensation, and you don't care if you have an orgasm or not. You just give yourself 10 minutes to just experience your body. No pressure. You don't have to reach any goal. It's just to enjoy the present moment with yourself. So it's learning how to connect with your body, be curious about your pleasure, and free yourself from that super performative vision we have of sex, which is you need to have an orgasm. And linked to that question, the second most popular question we get is, why don't I get orgasm when I am with my partner? Here again, it's often in the context of heterosexual sex. So it often comes back to the question of being very focused on penetration, so moving the focus away from the internal stimulation and towards clitoral and external stimulation in general, freeing yourself from, again, the pleasure of having an orgasm. And the thing that is always a bit of a challenge is learning to communicate your pleasure with your partner. And to do that, you need to know how to have pleasure. And that's why masturbation is so important, because you get educated on your own pleasure, and then you can share it with whomever you're having sex with.
1000%.
But if you don't know how your pleasure works, then how are you supposed to explain it to someone else?
Also, interestingly enough, I think that is an interesting question, because in my experience of talking to people about partnered sex, it's not like the partner just exclusively does it. Clearly you are still involved, usually, when it comes to putting your hand on their hand, or, saying oh, faster, slower, it should be, a team effort, I think.
You're completely right. I think maybe I don't like to have that kind of gendered idea that we've been taught to have more of a passive role, but there is it's important to realize how much we own our pleasure. And we do have to be active, and even mentally, like how much are we thinking about what's going on when we're having sex, to keep on arousing ourselves and connecting to the moment and connecting to our body. And there's something very exciting about this idea that we are in charge of our pleasure, because then we can really unlock an amazing world of sensation. And one thing that sometimes comes in the way of vulva's pleasure is pain, which is a question that we also get a lot, like, why do I feel pain during sex? And we've surveyed women all around the world, and out of 10 women said they've experienced pain during sex. It's a huge number. So it's very common. So of course, the first question is, how do you make yourself comfortable doing sex? I don't know, it can be using lubricants, doing intercourse more, not doing penetrative sex if that makes you feel pain, but to really feel more entitled to your pleasure as well, and to say, no, pain is just a no. So if I'm feeling pain right now, we just stop and we do something else. And that ties back to owning your pleasure and being active when you have intercourse. And it's about understanding what helps your body being comfortable while you're having sex, to make sure that you will ask for lubricants, or you will say no, or you will ask for something else that brings you more pleasure. And really, all these questions, they tie back to knowing and understanding how our body works and how our pleasure anatomy works. There was a very interesting TED Talk, I don't know if you've seen it, by Peggy Orenstein.
I know her. She's a really famous author, but I haven't seen her TED Talk.
Oh, you need to. I'm sure you're going to love it. And it's very thought-provoking. So it's about girls and sex. So like young girls, how we educate girls about the topic of sex. And she has a quote in this TED Talk that I always have in the back of my mind because it's so striking. She says, boys have erection and ejaculation. Girls have periods and unwanted pregnancies. That's how we are educated when we go through our teenage years. And that's like very shocking when you realize that that's actually quite true. We're just not taught about our own pleasure. We are taught that we have periods, so we have a reproductive system that we need to manage, and that's basically it. And we're not taught that, oh yeah, you could... sex can be fun, sex can be pleasurable. That's not even something that is put in our head.
Yes, completely. 1,000,000,000%. I really want to read her book. I've heard that it's really, really fantastic. But so much of my work and free time is taken up by sex that usually when I read for pleasure, it's something else, but definitely have to add that to my list. Well, Cecile, this has been incredible. We have one last question for you. And that is, where is Smile Makers going next with toys and sexual wellness? And if there's kind of one thing you want to make sure to leave our listeners with, what would that be?
Okay. For Smile Makers, as I'm sure you've picked up by now, we're very focused on education, like making pleasure positive sex education widely accessible. So we've created a full program called Vulva Talks. It's available for free. It has written and video content. And that's also why we love podcasts like yours, because it's so important to bring that conversation to as many people as we can. Obviously expanding our offering to bring like new stimulations and provide more options to explore our pleasure. And then, I don't know, like continuing to expand our distribution so we can bring vibrators to as many vulva owners as we can. And the last thing I'd like to add is that we really encourage vulva owners to enjoy some erotica and like be curious about their fantasies. It's not necessarily an aspect, again, that we are educated on, but that's something that we're big fans of at Smile Makers, is to encourage our community to explore their fantasies by reading, by writing them, for a very simple reason, is that it is about validating our desires and getting curious about our own sexuality. And it has nothing to do with products. It has nothing, you don't even have to touch yourself, but it's a way to really connect with your sexual identity.
Love it. Love it so, so much. This has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for
It's my
sharing.
pleasure.
Yeah, for sharing all of, the data and the, those positive and amazing ideas just around positive sexuality. And really, like you said, at the end of the day, you don't even, no pressure to even touch yourself. Really, it's just getting connected
Yes.
with your with your body, mind, and soul is what I was trying to say. And yeah, just like, knowing yourself a little bit better and being happier and healthier.
Yeah. And not like this is how you leave the stigma at the scale of your own person. So you are contributing to changing the world by just validating your desire, validating your sexuality, if nothing else.
Our creator, co-producer, sound engineer, and host is me, Danielle Bezalel, aka DB. Our co-producer and communications lead is Cathren Cohen. Our main logo and banner graphic were created by Andrea Forgacs. Our social media intern is Leslie Lopez. Our music theme is by Hook Sounds. Our ad music is by my stepdad, Bill Gant. Thank you so much to our featured guests, partners, and our listeners. If you're interested in advertising with us, email us at sexedwithdb@gmail.com. For more sex ed content, follow us on Insta @sexedwithdb podcast. Tune in next time.